Today I'm going to finish talking about the parts of chapter 15 that I think are relevant. I think I posted to Canvas that I'm only going to ask you to go up through about page 445 in your reading of chapter 15. The second half of chapter 15 is about something called the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, or something like that. And it's primarily useful when you get into situations where you're programming large systems of equations to try to predict what a small change in one part of the market would have on the rest of the market. Now, at the International Trade Commission in Washington, D.C., where I worked for 3 years, they had a very large program like this, where they had thousands of equations. And this model was used to try to predict what reducing tariff rates on certain industries, what that effect would cause to happen in other industries and in trade flows across countries. So these equations included what's called an Armington elasticity, which is the elasticities of relative trade flows for certain products in different industries among all of the countries in the world. These models, were so huge that they were housed in a computer in the guy's office across the hall from me. And this would have been almost 10 years ago. He was running something with 64 gigs of RAM. Right? Most of your computers have like 16 gigs at the most, right? And he was just running this enormous model. It would still take him 3 or 4 days for the model to complete its processing, right? Just an enormous model. Now, if you're interested in those kinds of things, I would encourage you to go ahead and finish reading the chapter to get a little bit of a feel for that. If you find yourself fascinated by it, one of the 2 best universities in the world for learning that process is at Purdue. They have a completely separate department, a completely separate economics department that is focused solely on the developing of these models and learning how to program them and how to make adjustments to those models. I had a close colleague, young woman who I shared an office with when I was at the International Trade Commission. She was an undergraduate at American University at the time. She went on to go to Purdue years and years ago to get her PhD in just that. And now she works for somebody in France that uses these models. The other big university for building these models is Monash University in Australia. So if you're interested in those kinds of things, that's there. I'm not going to get into it. It's a little bit too complex for me, and for at this level, I don't see how it aids our intuition to go too far into all of that. So instead, what I'll do is I'll kind of wind down the ideas that are in the first half of chapter 15. And where I left off talking about that, and I don't know if I got the video up or not already. I think I did get a video up from Monday. Was a large expression that sort of incorporates a lot of the important ideas here. So we have this equation, I equals pi at time t plus rho plus, I don't remember what that's, theta or something, I don't know. Theta of theta sub pi t minus pi t star plus theta y of yt minus y. Oops. I do that frequently when I come to this y. Y bar t. Now, what this equation is trying to identify is how to get to a nominal interest rate, which is the policy that the Federal Reserve is targeting. You're trying to, you read about it in the news. The Fed is targeted a blah, blah, blah interest rate. What's in that? Well, an awful lot of stuff. First of all, there is the inflation that is happening at time t. Then there is the natural rate of interest, which is represented by rho, because we didn't have enough symbols talking about interest rates yet, so we decided to add another one. All right, then there is this, let's call it theta, it might be wrong, parameter on the deviation of inflation from its target. So this is the inflation rate that emerges, that we observe in the real world, but what was the targeted inflation rate? If this is not the same as this, then there's a quantity that emerges, and we want to know, well, how much does this impact the nominal interest rate? What's the responsiveness of the natural interest rate to deviations from the expected or the inflation rate that is targeted? And this is just some number, like any number can go here. That's just a parameter that captures the responsiveness of this. Now, if we were running regressions, we would probably come up with a number that is observed in times past on this variable that we would then use for making predictions going into the future. I don't know what that number would be, right off the top of my head. And then again, we have deviations in output from the natural rate of output. The natural rate of output is determined by real factors in the real world, which is from your intro macro course, sort of analogous to your long-run aggregate supply curve. So this is what the world can do when resources are fully employed. This is what actually is going to happen. There's a deviation from our long-run aggregate supply curve. And then this term again is a parameter on how responsive the nominal interest rate is to deviations of output from the natural rate of output. It's huge. It's a big model. And walking through it like this, talking yourself through the equation a couple of times will help you to sort of gather more of the intuition involved there. One thing that you're going to want to remember is that the real interest rate is the difference between the nominal interest rate and what our expectations today are about what inflation is going to be when we observe it tomorrow. So the nominal interest rate is similarly the sum of the real interest rate plus inflation, but today the real interest rate is determined by what it can be observed by the nominal interest rate, and then our expectations about what inflation is going to be over the course of the next year. Now, we all have some expectation about what inflation is going to be. What is the most natural expectation about what inflation is going to be?
2.
Sorry?
2%.
Why?
That's what the Fed targets.
Okay, so if we believe the Fed, right, that's a big if, then we can expect that the Fed is going to be targeting this. But think about it from the point of view of the Fed instead, right? What are their expectations about inflation going into the future? Our best guess, if we don't do anything else, right, if nothing else changes, our best guess is that inflation next year is going to be the same as inflation was last year. Right? This is the same idea as the efficient markets hypothesis, which would say that what are our expectations about which stocks are going to do how well next year? The best we can know is whatever they were last year. And then if we have any other information about any of the firms that exist in the world, that information will most likely already be incorporated into the price of the stock as we observe it today, so that you really can't pick winners or losers. So that's from the rational expectations point of view, which goes a little bit farther than this, right? Okay. Now, given this, we can say, well, if inflation hits its target, and if output succeeds at landing directly on equilibrium, then this term is 0, this term is 0, a number multiplied by 0 is 0, any other number multiplied by 0 is 0. And so what we're left with is simply just this chunk of this. So understanding again that r of t is equal to I at t minus pi at t, we get the natural rate of interest would be pi of t plus rho. So then, the Fed adjusts the supply of money so as to achieve its target, and that then arrives at the nominal interest rate, which is what we read about in the newspaper. Now, what should this be? And there's a big should there, right? A big pile of should in the middle of the classroom. And there's a lot of different attitudes about what this should be. Again, it's normative, but it's normative with a purpose. One of the most well understood rules is what we call now the Taylor rule. Named after John Taylor. And he says that the nominal federal funds rate should be, so the nominal Fed funds rate should be inflation plus 2.0% plus 0.5 times inflation minus 2% plus 0.5 times the GDP gap, which is similar to the equation that I just erased. I probably should have. Which, again, if inflation is held constant, if GDP hits its target, then we end up with a 2% rate, as you mentioned before. Why 2%? Where does that number come from? Where did they come up with that idea that it should be 2%? Well, it's big enough that it can actually do some work. It allows for prices to rise gradually. We like prices to go up gradually. It sets an expectation that prices will gradually go up, and so then everybody can have rational expectations about that going forward. It leaves some room for the Fed to be involved in the case of a shock to bring about a rate lower than that, which is what they would want to do in the case of a shock, right? And it's not too large. Right? You wouldn't want to set this at 10%. Historically, we've observed that when inflation rates get higher, they also become more volatile. And so we want to maintain a low degree of volatility. Now, Taylor sets up this rule, and a lot of people like it and adopt it. Why? Because it binds the Fed. It constrains what the Fed is, quote unquote, allowed to do, takes away some of their discretionary activity. All right, so this is sort of a constitutional concept going all the way back to all of the other kinds of constitutional motivations that some economists introduce into the policy space, suggesting that we need to bind our institutions with some sort of rules so that we can have good expectations about what they're going to do and they don't run rampant and do whatever the hell they want to. We want to have some constraints on them for their sake and for ours as well. Now, typically, those who are at the Fed have different ideas about this. Some are in agreement with being constrained. Some would rather allow themselves more discretion. And recently, we've observed that the Fed abandoned its 2% target which was closely tied to the Taylor rule, and has instead said that we're going to use 2% as an average over time. The Taylor rule has functioned so as to prevent the Fed from going above a 2%. It's been more like a ceiling for the Fed than something else. What's going to happen now is that the Fed is going to allow itself, which is kind of ironic by itself, that it's going to allow itself to go above 2% so as to achieve an average over the long run of inflation of 2%. So there's a whole lot of fascinating conversation going on right now about how the Fed is changing its interaction with the marketplace, how it has switched from a 2% ceiling, which is what it effectively has been, to adopting what it should have or maybe already meant to mean, which is a 2% average. I would recommend to you the work of George Selgin on this issue, and I'm going to talk about Selgin again soon. George Selgin has a book called Less Than Zero. He has another book called Floored, and these are both about how the Federal Reserve is involved at setting different kinds of interest rates. The Less Than Zero book suggests that interest rates could become negative, which seems contradictory to some of our understanding about these ideas. The Floored book is about how the Fed has moved away from an open markets interaction kind of role in trying to achieve its targets towards a different structure, a different set of tools to try to achieve its mandates. You can listen to Selgin talking about these kinds of issues quite frequently on Macro Musings, which is a podcast. And if you were to listen to that podcast and understand half of what they say, you'd be doing well. I listen to it just so that I have some of these ideas in the back of my head. And I'm working with it. I can bring some of them to you. I am not a trained macroeconomist. I'm bringing you what I understand about it from the literature and what I have read. But these guys think about this stuff all the time and write about it regularly. And they're involved in what's happening right now. Oftentimes, the guy who runs this podcast will have people who work for the Fed come in and talk, or he'll have people who work for other central banks talk about how different central banks are trying to respond to the current crisis and how they have responded to other crises in the past. Okay. Any questions? All right. So then, what we're left with is just a big chunk of these different equations combined together to put together a model that, again, if you're interested, you can walk through at the end of chapter 15. What I'd like to do now is to take a few steps backwards. I never really got around to talking about the Great Depression and the discussion that Mankey provides about the Great Depression and the 2008-2009 recession in the second half of chapter 12. So I'm going to go back to chapter 12 for a little while and talk about that material today. If you haven't chosen your book for the end of the year, that book, Floored by Selgin, would be a great one. Okay, so looking back at the Great Depression, what do you know about the Great Depression? Can you name a film that is about what happened during the Great Depression? Have you seen a movie about the Great Depression era? Anybody ever see a movie about the Great Depression era? Did you ever see Cinderella Man with Russell Crowe? He plays a boxer. There's an old Disney movie called The Journey of Natty Gann. It was about the Depression era. What are your basic understandings of what happened during the Great Depression? What it was like to live during that time period? For beginners, you have to place yourself in 1930. Did you read The Great Gatsby? by Fitzgerald in high school. That's the Roaring Twenties, right? We talk a lot about the Roaring Twenties. Then did you read The Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck? Right? That's the Depression, right? That's what happens during the Depression. So the Dust Bowl combined with economic collapse at the same time. Other books that were around that same area. Karen Hesse has a book, a children's book called Out of the Dust. It's actually some poems that's about this era. Other books that were about that era that come to mind? None? Okay. So there's a bit of a gap, right, in our understanding about what life was like then, because we don't have as much historical context. So it is useful to learn a little bit of this history, maybe to watch a film about the era, to get a real feel for what was happening at the time. Again, you got to put yourself in 1930 and realize a lot of the economic growth that we currently are experiencing and enjoying hasn't happened yet. In 1930, refrigeration is not all that common. Not all American houses have electricity or indoor plumbing. The automobile is there, but it's not nearly as sophisticated or reliable as what we have today. In World War I, people were still using horses to fight the war, right? So you got to put yourself in that sort of time period to sort of get a feel for what's going on. Did you see Annie? Anybody ever seen the movie Annie with the little redheaded girl? No? You guys watch TV? Right? Gosh, Annie was the first film I saw in the theater. Yeah, that puts an age on me. What do we know about the Great Depression? Between 1929 and 1933, right, output falls. Between 1933 and 1940, output goes up. And there's a table in your textbook that if you walk through it carefully and read the numbers, it's helpful. Between 1929 and 1933, the interest rate fell. Between 1933 and 1940, the interest rate continued to fall. Is there a connection between the interest rate and output? And that's what we've been doing this whole time, looking at the interest rate and output. So if we have between 1929 and 1933, both output and the interest rate are falling, we're moving in this direction. But then if between 1933, output is increasing and the interest rate is falling, we're moving in this direction. Can you draw a set of ISLM curves that fit that data? To give it a shot. We've got 3 points here. Let's call it here, and here, and here. All right, start with an initial set of conditions. So you've got IS here, and LM here. Well, we don't need to shift our LM curve in order to move down to here. A simple shift of the IS curve can accomplish that. But then to move down to here, we would have to ride along this IS curve, and then our LM curve would have to shift down. So the spending hypothesis that tries to explain what happened in the Great Depression looks at these variables and says, how can we explain these variables within the framework that we have going on here? And it says, end of the Roaring 20s, beginning of the Depression, the stock market collapses. When the stock market collapses, consumer wealth is eroded. So anybody who had some wealth has lost a lot of it, and as a result, consumer consumption falls. When consumption falls, we have a shift of the IS curve. We move along the LM curve. That causes a lower interest rate. At the same time, when the stock market crashed, the housing market crashed. So there may have been a bubble in housing before the Great Depression, as well as when what we had in 2008. What might have caused the collapse of the housing market? Maybe it was just because it was a bubble and then it popped. The text hypothesizes that perhaps new restrictions on immigration caused there to be an unachieved expectation about the demand for housing. So if you're building new houses with the expectation that there's going to continue that same flow of new immigrants that want to buy houses, but then all of a sudden that flow of immigrants dries up because we put in place a bunch of racist laws against immigration, then those expectations won't be achieved, and so you've got more houses than you need. Again, remember that a lot of times when we're talking about recessions, we're talking about unused inputs into production, or unused resources, unused workers, and unused houses. So underutilized stock of things. So that happens. Another thing that happens is because of the stock market crash, banks fail, and there's a run on banks. Okay, here's another movie. How many of you have ever watched It's a Wonderful Life at Christmas time? Your families ever watched It's a Wonderful Life? Okay, so that movie shows the stock market crash and how all the banks are failing, and the savings and loans also failing. So George Bailey tries to keep his institution alive, and he does it by dipping into his own savings. Well, that definitely hurt his consumption. He ends up moving into the worst house in town, right? With the help of Mary Tyler Moore, they fix it up. Woohoo! Okay. What else can happen? Well, we have this collapse in consumption. And at the same time, there are political motivations that are demanding for a balanced budget. Keynes argues that the correct response to a recession is to increase fiscal policy, to increase spending and to reduce taxes. But at the time of the Great Depression, those who are in Congress are trying to be very fiscally conservative. Not that they are conservatives, but they're trying to be conservative in their attitudes and behavior. We're not in a war anymore. We were in a boom, so we can raise taxes and cut government spending, constrain the size of government, and try to get our budget balanced again. That was their idea. And so at the same time, when Keynes would have recommended that the government increase its spending, the government is actually decreasing its spending. At the same time, when Keynes would have recommended to cut taxes, the government is increasing the tax rate. Okay. So here's the explanation of how all this came together. Now, the second step here might fit better with what's called the monetary hypothesis. As the supply of money, in response in part to the Depression, the Fed reduced the supply of money. Now, they thought they were doing the right thing. Or at least we can characterize it as them thinking that they were doing the right thing. A reduction in the supply of money leads to the unemployment rate going up. What happened here, though, is that usually we think about M over P having a relationship to I and Y. They were reducing the quantity of money. But at the same time, prices were falling even faster than the supply of money was being contracted. They thought they were doing the right thing to shift LM back up. But because prices were falling faster than that, the interest rate continued to fall. So the Fed did, in a way, exactly the wrong thing at the same time as fiscal policy did exactly the wrong thing, leading to what could have been a simple recession falling into the Great Depression. Prices fell, so here's output, here's interest rates. Prices fell 22%. Now, usually, when prices fall, that's a signal of increases in productivity. Why are things less expensive than they were in the past to the extent that they were? Because we've gotten more productive in creating those things. We can think about laptops or our smartphones. Even though they seem to be getting more expensive for what we're getting, they're actually less expensive. And food is much less expensive than it has been in the past due to increases in productivity. Prices were falling really fast. If prices are falling, and if the money supply is being held constant, for a hypothetical here, and prices fall, right, that causes the LM curve to shift down. That is, the real interest rate will go up, and so the real interest rate will go down, and output will go up. Well, if that's the end of it, that's fine, but there's another feedback mechanism, perhaps, that is influencing the total outcome of the situation. That's called the Pigou effect. Now, if any of you are particularly ambitious and want to read Pigou, that would be fascinating. That would be something to do if you are ever in the long run interested in doing the history of economic thought. Pigou is famously the economist who talks about using taxes and subsidies to overcome externality problems. So when we increase taxes on carbon in order to try to reduce pollution, that's called a Pigou tax. Okay? And Pigou had things to say about macroeconomic situations as well. He says that when prices fall, consumption goes up. If consumption goes up, then that should shift the IS curve to the right, and that should increase both output and the interest rate. So then, a fall in prices from the Pigouvian point of view would be a good thing. Or is it? So there's debate about to what extent this fall in prices has an impact on macroeconomic conditions. In particular, deflation can tend to destabilize things. How is it that deflation can destabilize expectations? We have a certain expectation about what the inflation rate is going to be. And when we sign our contracts for things like student loans, that's baked into our expectations. So, okay, we are willing to sign for a 6% interest rate on our student loans because we have an expectation of 2% inflation, such that when we end up having to actually pay back those loans, we expect our income to be high enough to be able to easily manage the payback of those loans. It's worth 4% in real terms to us to develop that human capital. However, if that expectation of inflation is backwards, if instead we have deflation, then that 4% or that 6% nominal interest rate with a 4% real interest rate baked into it becomes a real 8% interest rate. So you end up having to pay back more in real terms than you would expect because your income doesn't achieve what your expectations for it had been. You expected some inflation to occur, that your income would go up, but inflation doesn't happen, deflation comes, you're earning less than you expected to, so the payback on those loans is a heavier burden. So deflation is unexpected for the most part, and as a result, when it actually does obtain, it causes a massive redistributive effect in terms of wealth. Those who have written a loan to you for the student loan, they're going to be made better off. and those who are borrowing money are going to be made worse off over the course of the loan. Well, we have to ask ourselves, who's more likely to be a consumer? Because if borrowers and lenders in this context are both affected, lenders have more money than what they were expecting, the borrowers have less money than what they were expecting, they could just offset each other. It could be a wash. It shouldn't necessarily have a major effect on the macroeconomic situation. But if borrowers are more likely to spend than lenders, so if the change in consumption is negative here, and the change in consumption, so call this B, call this L, is positive, if DCB is equal to DCL, no big deal. But if the change in spending of borrowers is greater than the change in spending of lenders, then on net, the total change in consumption will be negative, and that'll have a contractionary consequence on the macroeconomy. So we have to think about who's going to be impacted and how, to what extent. Okay, so what are we doing, right? We're providing narratives, we're telling stories, we're using our model to try to walk through those narratives, to try to see what could have come out and why. Another story has to do with expectations. And a recognition of the distinction between nominal and real interest rates. Again, R equals I minus our expectations about inflation. We have an expectation about inflation ex ante, before it happens, before the world changes. So if we bake this in, and we did this already in chapter 15, so I'm going backwards and covering stuff that we've covered in more detail already, but perhaps this provides some background to that. And if this is our IS curve and this is our LM curve, within this model, the only place that expectations show up directly is right here. So if our expectations about the future and expectations about inflation or deflation in the future enter into our model, they enter in primarily through a shift of the IS curve. It's in here too a little bit, but not nearly as directly as it is here. And to the extent that it's in the nominal interest rate, it's also in the nominal interest rate here. If our expectations about inflation are negative, it pushes the IS curve down. What happens if the IS curve falls? Remember we had the real interest rate here. So if the IS curve contracts, we're left with the new interest rate. However, this interest rate is our nominal interest rate at our new level of output. But it's not the same as the real interest rate. The real interest rate would actually be the interest rate that is along our old IS curve at this output. That is, if an investor is involved and they expect deflation, they're going to observe a nominal interest rate that is lower, but they're going to behave as if the real interest rate has gone up, because to them, for them to borrow during a time period of deflation would mean that when they have to pay it back, they have to pay back more than the interest rate that shows up on their contracts. They have to pay back the nominal interest rate once you've also incorporated the deflationary element. It's going to cost them more to pay back in the long run. As a consequence, investment decreases, which is the opposite of what we would expect for a lower interest rate. We were showing our details earlier, the interest rate fell. Well, when that interest rate fell, it wasn't the interest rate that lenders were thinking about or borrowers were thinking about. This is the interest rate that they would have been thinking about and realizing, you know what, it's not worth borrowing now. If it's not worth borrowing, then it's not worth investing in capital. If it's not worth investing in capital, then productivity decreases. If productivity decreases, output decreases, and everybody gets hungry. Okay. When that happened, the Fed could have loosened up the supply of money, but it didn't. So the Fed became culpable for the consequences of the Depression as well. So then we have to ask, okay, everybody did the wrong thing during the Great Depression, but we seem to understand a little bit about some of the ways they did the wrong thing. Shouldn't that mean that we'll never have a depression again? Well, we had a recession in 2008. And people said we didn't learn from the Depression. Part of what happened is that we actually haven't fully come to a total consensus about what actually happened during the Great Depression. There's still these competing narratives about what happened during the Depression, different models, and it's hard to get good data from back then. I posted a video this week about women in economics. One of them was about Christina Romer. One of the things that she showed was that economists, macroeconomists for a long time thought that before the Depression, the volatility of the marketplace was very, very high, and that after the Depression, that volatility was less. Well, it's because we had better data after the Depression. She shows that if you look at the same data from after the Depression through the lenses that were available to people before the Depression, the volatility would look exactly the same. In other words, maybe we haven't figured it out. Maybe we ought not to be so confident. Maybe we ought not to have any kind of hubris about the way that we're approaching the economy. We can say that the Fed and Congress were not as likely to make the same exact errors in the same exact way that they had done during the Great Depression again. What happened in 2008? Leading up to 2008, there had been a housing boom. How do we know? Because it popped. Why didn't we know beforehand? Some people did. Some people guessed that it did anyway. How would we know whether there is a housing boom or not? Are prices of houses going up faster than the prices of other goods and services? Or maybe just people want to spend more of their income on houses. That could be a real price change. One of the speculations is that coming out of another small recession we had in 2001, interest rates had been pushed very, very low. When interest rates are pushed low, it becomes cheap to borrow. When it becomes cheap to borrow, you buy more. And so one of the things that happened leading up to the housing crash was that people were buying more house. Sometimes they were literally buying more houses, but also they were buying more house. Drive around Muncie and look at houses that were built in the 60s and 50s, and then drive around Fishers and look at houses that were built more recently, and you'll see that when you buy a house that's new, you're buying a lot more house, right? Okay, so more house was being bought, and people were investing extra income that they received in their house, improving the quality of their house as well. So we had this housing boom because interest rates were low. Now also remember, when you think about pricing bonds and other assets, when the interest rate goes down, the value of those assets also goes up. This bakes into some of the Austrian theory about business cycles as well. When interest rates are low and artificially low, people can be fooled about what the real interest rate is and then invest in projects that aren't quite worth investing in. It's called mal-investment, mal meaning bad, right? So maybe people were mal-investing in houses. They were taking on risky loans, and then those risky loans were securitized. Then the bubble popped, and between 2006 and 2009, housing prices fell by 30%. Now, I bought a house in 2008, the middle of 2008. And that house had been for sale for $320,000. Right? It was actually a condo, townhouse. And we got the house for around $260,000. Right? So we got a really great deal on that house because it wasn't just the $260,000. The people who had planned on buying that house had spec'd it out to the max, right? The nicest countertops, the extra fireplace, the extra trim and molding, and all of this sort of thing was all added into that house before we bought it. So we were actually buying a house that was worth $330,000 before the recession, and we got it for $260,000. And the reason that happened was because the couple who had spec'd that house out had financial troubles related to the recession, and they actually got divorced. And in the divorce, they said neither of them was going to buy the house, okay? So then during this recession, defaults on mortgages went through the roof. Foreclosures went through the roof. Now, if a house is foreclosed upon, that means that you have to turn around and sell it. So the banks were foreclosing on houses that had people in them that weren't paying the mortgages, and then trying to sell them, but the prices of houses was already falling. Well, if you try to sell in a falling market, you're just adding more supply to the market, and think about your supply-demand graph and realize, okay, that's going to push prices down even further. As a result, the banking system was completely wrecked. Banks didn't trust each other. Banks had a hard time trusting people who asked for a loan, so there was hardly any loans going out. At the same time, the stock market was becoming very, very volatile. And so consumers lost their confidence about the future and about spending. Here we have a situation where consumer attitudes became pessimistic, which is sort of the Keynesian idea of animal spirits. But in this sense, that pessimism was justified. It was rational. Even rats are rational, right? What happened? The Fed cut interest rates from 5% down to close to 0%. Congress came in and bailed out the banks. They increased their spending in order to try to boost aggregate demand. The Fed introduced a whole bunch of new policies, started buying long-term bonds, started buying mortgages themselves, and then they also started paying interest on reserves. As a result, it could be that the response of the Fed and Congress to the recession was more appropriate than fiscal policy and monetary policy was in the Depression, and perhaps they helped us to avoid another Great Depression. Perhaps. However, right now we're in a situation where interest rates remain very, very low. These low interest rates are related to something called a liquidity trap. It doesn't give the Fed much room to respond to another situation like a pandemic. Interest rates were already very low. This has pressured the Fed to start doing even more unusual interactions with the marketplace. And here's where I would recommend to you to look at Selgin's work in his book Less Than Zero or in Floyd, and to his appearances on Macro Musings to get an idea about how a liquidity trap or zero lower bound can cause problems in Fed policy. Other things that the Fed did was to buy, again, longer term bonds, mortgages. They called that forward guidance, trying to think about the longer-term bonds instead of only buying short-term bonds. It was a way to bind the Fed to committing to having a low interest rate for a long period of time. And then buying of mortgages and other assets was quantitative easing. It was pushing more money into the economy. So that term quantitative easing, which you may be familiar with, I've heard before, is related to the Fed pushing more money into the economy. But how does the Fed put money into the economy? It has to buy something in order to do it, so it started buying things that it didn't used to buy. Okay. At this point, the question is whether or not the Fed will increase inflation. And perhaps it will. Perhaps it will. But there's a lot going on right now, which is why it's hard for me even to know exactly what to pass on to you other than just what the textbook has in it, because the situation is evolving under our feet. Thanks for being patient with me. Hope to see you guys next week.